Before the paint, the pyrotechnics, and the platinum records, Paul Stanley's voice was the driving force behind Kiss. Born Stanley Burt Eisen in Queens, New York, Paul had a natural affinity for performance. He wasn't just another frontman. He was the voice that gave the band its theatrical edge and radio power. Unlike Gene Simmons' demonic growl, Paul brought the soaring vocals, the anthemic choruses, and the glam charisma that defined Kiss in their prime. In the early days, think 1974's self-titled debut and 1975's Dress to Kill, Paul's vocal range was astonishing. He hit high notes with ease, his tone crisp and bold. Songs like Strutter and Rock and Roll All Night weren't just rockers, they were showcases of Stanley's vocal command. By the time Alive was released, fans could hear that unmistakable voice cutting through the roar of arenas, owning every second of the performance. His voice wasn't just part of the show, it was the show. What made Paul special was his control. He could wail without going hoarse, belt without breaking. And more than that, he was consistent, even live. Few frontmen in the 70s could pull off a nightly tour schedule and still sound as good on stage as they did on record. Stanley could, but that was then. Fast forward 3 decades, and fans began to notice something had changed. By the early 2000s, especially around the Rock the Nation tour in 2004, Paul's once soaring voice started to crack under pressure. Critics and fans alike began asking, what's going on with Paul Stanley's voice? The truth? His vocal cords were taking a beating. The very gift that brought Kiss their anthemic sound had become a source of strain. Stanley had spent over 30 years screaming, belting, and pushing his voice beyond human limits, night after night. Unlike many rockers who gradually adjusted their technique or reduced their range, Paul kept giving 100%, and it caught up with him. Vocal cords are muscles. When pushed too hard for too long, especially in loud environments like KISS's explosive shows, they wear out. Paul didn't just sing. He projected over fire, explosions, feedback, and tens of thousands of screaming fans. Add to that the years of touring, and you get the perfect storm for vocal damage. In 2009, Stanley quietly underwent vocal cord surgery. While it wasn't widely publicized at the time, it was a necessary move. His voice had become hoarse, strained, and inconsistent. Even die-hard fans could hear it, but the surgery was only part of the story. What followed was a long, complex battle to maintain the voice that helped build a rock empire. While the surgery in 2009 was a major turning point, it wasn't a cure-all. Paul Stanley returned to touring with Kiss, but the strain of performance didn't vanish. In fact, it intensified. The band's schedule remained relentless, city after city, show after show, and the demands on Paul's voice never let up. It's one thing to recover in a studio environment. It's another to do it in front of 20,000 fans expecting perfection. By 2012's The Tour with Motley Crue and again during the End of the Road tour years later, fans and reviewers increasingly noted vocal issues. Cracked notes, pitch problems, strained falsettos, all signs that his voice wasn't bouncing back like it used to. Stanley was doing everything he could to keep the magic alive, but physically, his vocal cords weren't cooperating. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Paul Stanley is famously proud. He refused to mime or lip sync for much of his career, even as other aging rockers resorted to pre-recorded vocals. He pushed his voice because he had to. He was Paul Stanley. The guy on the mic had to sound like Kiss. No exceptions. But that iron-willed determination came at a cost. What might have been a gradual decline became a dramatic one. And for fans watching live in the 2010s, the difference was impossible to ignore. Eventually, even Paul Stanley had to make a decision. By the late 2010s, especially during the End of the Road farewell tour, rumors began to circulate that Paul was using backing tracks. Die-hard fans, trained to spot live vocals from studio perfect ones, called it out. Paul wasn't singing every line anymore, and they weren't wrong. Clips from live shows began circulating online, showing moments where Paul would pull the microphone away, but his vocals kept going. Other times he would let the crowd sing a chorus, only for his voice to continue in the mix. For a band that had always sold itself as live and loud, this felt like a betrayal to some. Stanley, for his part, didn't openly admit to lip syncing, but he didn't deny it either. In interviews, he vaguely referenced the difficulty of performing at a high level in his 60s and 70s. Gene Simmons, however, made comments that raised eyebrows. In one 2019 interview, Gene stated, "I sing completely live. That's all I'll say about that." Fans took it as a subtle jab, confirmation that Paul was indeed relying on help. But here's the thing. Paul's vocal troubles weren't a scandal. They were inevitable. No one, not even a vocal powerhouse like Stanley, can sustain the same range and power for 50 years. The real tragedy wasn't that Paul needed help. It's that he waited so long to accept it. Paul Stanley wasn't just any frontman, he was the frontman. His energy defined Kiss shows. The way he ran across the stage, shredded solos, nailed screams, and tossed out playful banter, all of it was integral to the Kiss experience. But by the mid-2010s, something had shifted. Fans could feel it. Paul didn't move the same way, didn't sing the same way, and despite the glitz of pyro and platforms, something was off. That something was reality. Aging in rock is unforgiving, and Paul's career, from early club days to arena domination, came with a heavy price. Decades of touring, plus congenital hearing issues, he was born with microtia, where his right ear was underdeveloped, meant his sense of pitch and tone had always required extra effort. He had to work to hear himself right. Now, with damaged cords and the strain of compensating, that effort was magnified. Still, there's a kind of quiet courage in how Paul handled it. He didn't run from the stage, he didn't quit, he adjusted. As the band leaned on technology, Paul leaned on the showmanship. He gave fans something to look at, even when he couldn't give them the same sound. Lights, lasers, fire, all meant to draw attention from what fans were hearing to what they were feeling. By 2020, with the end of the road tour paused during the COVID-19 pandemic, Paul Stanley took a breath, maybe for the first time in years. And in that breath, he found something unexpected, a new kind of music. He launched Paul Stanley's Soul Station, a retro soul project channeling the Motown and R&B influences of his youth. It was a major shift, from glam rock to silky ballads and lush orchestrations, and with it, Paul embraced a different side of his voice. Gone were the screaming highs and over-the-top vibrato. In Soul Station, Paul sang within his range. He let the arrangements carry the melody. He focused on emotion, not power, phrasing instead of firepower. And it worked. Songs like Ooh Baby Baby and Could It Be I'm Falling in Love showed that Paul could still sing, just not like he used to. This was more than a side project. It was a quiet response to critics. Paul didn't need to prove anything on stage anymore. He was redefining success on his own terms, as a stylist, a crooner, and a lifelong lover of music. For fans who could look past the leather and flames, Soul Station revealed a man still devoted to the art of performing, even if he could no longer bring the thunder of his younger days. As the end of the road tour hit its stride, rumors turned into headlines. Fans were now filming Paul up close and dissecting every note, or lack thereof. Accusations of lip-syncing started to surface, with video evidence fueling debates. In some clips, Paul's voice could be heard before his mouth moved. In others, he backed away from the mic, yet the vocals kept going. Paul and the band remained silent for a while. Then in 2022, Gene Simmons casually confirmed it in an interview. Yes, Paul was using some backing tracks. He emphasized that it wasn't all fake, just sweetened in spots, comparing it to singers like Beyoncé or Britney Spears who rely on performance enhancements during live shows. But for some longtime Kiss fans, this felt like sacrilege. They weren't seeing a show, they were seeing Kiss, a band known for doing it all loud, live, and larger than life. Paul Stanley's voice, once a symbol of that rawness, was now part of a pre-recorded package. Some fans felt betrayed. Others were more understanding. After all, Paul was in his 70s, still doing 2-hour shows in boots and makeup, night after night. Few rock singers, maybe none, had maintained their range into their 70s without some sort of tech support. It was either this or quit, and Paul wasn't ready to quit. The real heartbreak wasn't in the criticism, it was in the truth behind it. Years of high-pitched screaming had taken a devastating toll on Paul Stanley's vocal cords. He had undergone multiple surgeries to repair vocal fold damage. One ENT specialist who never treated Paul but analyzed his performances suggested that his cords had likely suffered permanent trauma, thickening, scar tissue, possibly even partial paralysis of one cord. These are the kind of injuries that don't heal fully, no matter how advanced the treatment. Add to that the physical demands of Kiss shows. Cardio-heavy choreography, sweat-drenched armor, constant movement, and you've got a recipe for vocal disaster. To sing under those conditions without a perfect voice? Nearly impossible. Paul did try. He hired vocal coaches, adjusted the keys of some songs, and even cut certain screams entirely. But the heart of Kiss had always been the show. And so when it became clear he couldn't deliver vocally every night, the band leaned even harder into spectacle. Fire cannons, confetti storms, hydraulic lifts, all to compensate for the elephant in the room. Paul's voice was no longer what it once was, and everyone, including Paul, knew it. But there was still power in what he gave. Even when he mimed the notes, his presence screamed louder than ever. This is what it means to keep going, even when the tools break down. Despite the mounting criticism, Paul Stanley didn't walk away. Instead, he leaned into the heart of what Kiss had always been, not just music, but performance. Kiss wasn't a band that merely played songs. It was a traveling rock and roll circus. Fire, lights, explosions, and yes, now vocal tracks, but the experience remained larger than life. Paul told interviewers time and again that retiring wasn't just a matter of losing his voice, it was about legacy. "You don't quit when things get hard," he once said. "You adjust." So adjust he did. Paul began pacing himself vocally on stage, letting the crowd sing big hooks and avoiding extended screams. The set lists subtly evolved, high-register songs were minimized or dropped. He even used more talk singing and swagger during the in-between song banter, avoiding anything vocally risky. His stage persona didn't change much. He was still the star child. Tight outfits, glittering guitar, star on his face. And fans still screamed for him. For many, just seeing Paul Stanley, even in a diminished state, was worth the ticket price. There was nostalgia in that, and for Kiss, nostalgia was currency. Paul eventually started talking gently about the reality. In a 2023 interview, he reflected on the wear and tear of touring. He acknowledged the changes but framed them with dignity. "I'm not 25 anymore, none of us are," he said. "And what people are seeing is still Kiss. We're just doing it the best way we can." He didn't deny the use of backing tracks. Instead, he explained them in terms of respect, giving fans the sound they expected, even when his body couldn't always deliver it. He also began to open up more about the physical toll. Paul had been diagnosed with vocal cord hemorrhaging in the early 2000s. He'd had surgery. He'd seen specialists all over the world. At one point, it was suggested he might never sing again, but he fought back with therapy, diet, and training. By the 2020s, he was resigned to the fact that some of the damage was permanent. His voice was no longer his greatest tool. It was now a memory he carried, one he tried to honor every night. For diehard fans, hearing Paul say these things was bittersweet. On one hand, it confirmed what many had suspected for years. On the other, it humanized a rock god. Paul Stanley wasn't just an icon. He was a man growing older in public, refusing to quit, and that took courage. Kiss launched their End of the Road tour in 2019. Billed as the band's last ever global trek, the name said it all. This was the victory lap, the farewell, the curtain call. But for Paul Stanley, it was something else entirely. One last opportunity to reclaim control over the narrative of his voice. The tour was a juggernaut. It sold out arenas worldwide and became one of the highest-grossing farewell tours in rock history. Fans came out in droves, many seeing Kiss for the first or last time. And despite the whispers about backing tracks and faked vocals, most fans left satisfied. The spectacle delivered, the flames roared, the makeup gleamed, and Paul still commanded the crowd. But critics weren't silent. In countless reviews and YouTube breakdowns, fans analyzed vocal inconsistencies, mic placement, and performance lip syncs. Some were sympathetic, others scathing. To them, Paul was no longer just older. He was hiding, yet Paul pushed forward. In interviews, he softened his stance further, saying things like, "This is the best way to give the audience what they deserve." He seemed to embrace the reality, not deflect it. And fans, many of them now in their 50s, 60s, or older themselves, often responded with understanding. They too had lost a step. They too felt the passing of time. Watching Paul perform, even with help, was a reminder of their own youth and how far they'd come since. Away from the spotlight, Paul Stanley was dealing with more than just vocal decline. He had become a vocal advocate for mental health, especially after revealing his experiences with microtia, a birth defect in his right ear, and the emotional trauma of growing up feeling different. He also talked about the insecurity that haunted him, even during KISS's peak. That insecurity never fully left. And when his voice started to go, it reawakened the same self-doubt he'd buried under stadium anthems and face paint. Paul also admitted that aging hit him harder than expected. In his 2021 memoir, Face the Music, he talked about mortality, how watching peers die, retire, or fade into obscurity made him determined to go out on his terms. He refused to be remembered as a shell of his former self, and yet he was painfully aware that his voice was no longer what it once was. Privately, friends said he'd been devastated by some of the online criticism, especially from longtime fans. The jokes, the Kiss with Cliff's Notes memes, the auto-tune parodies, it stung. But Paul, ever the showman, chose to persevere. He turned down offers to do small club acoustic sets. He declined any project that would shrink KISS's legacy. To him, going big, even with vocal assistance, was better than fading away quietly. By the time Kiss played their final show in December 2023 at Madison Square Garden, the question wasn't whether Paul Stanley could still hit the notes. The question was, did it still matter? That night, as fireworks lit up the arena and the crowd screamed lyrics they'd carried for half a lifetime, Paul stood center stage, makeup cracked with sweat, voice hoarse, heart full. He didn't belt like he once did. But he didn't need to. Every fan in that building knew what he meant to them, what that voice had meant, because Paul Stanley's voice wasn't just sound, it was memory. It was summer nights blasting Love Gun from a cassette deck. It was stolen moments in bedrooms, hearing Detroit Rock City for the first time. It was the voice that turned a band into a religion. Sure, the purity of his singing had faded. Sure, backing tracks filled the gaps, but the legacy? Untouched. In the end, Paul Stanley's voice didn't vanish, it evolved. It became more than vocal cords or range. It became the story of a man who gave everything, until there was nothing left to give. Paul Stanley once said, "I'm not trying to be who I was, I'm trying to be the best of who I am now." And that's what his journey as a vocalist and a person is really about. He may not sound like the fire-breathing frontman of 1977 anymore, but he's still here, still swinging that microphone, still walking out to deafening crowds, and most importantly, still showing up, even when the world expects him to step back. In a genre that often chews up its stars and spits them out, Paul Stanley did something few rockers manage. He endured. Through surgeries, scrutiny, and aging in real time. He didn't fade away, he adapted. And that perhaps is the greatest performance of all. Thanks for watching Southern Sound. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments. And if you've ever seen Kiss live, whether in the 70s or just last year, we want to hear your stories. Because legends like Paul Stanley don't just belong to history books, they belong to us. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the music that shaped our lives. Rock on.